Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Devon and Cornwall branch Next Technical online event, which is a presentation today from Dean Robson from CleanEarth Energy. It's great that we got so many online again today. I'll pass you straight over to Dean.
Thanks, everyone, for giving me this opportunity. Imri's asked me to host this. We do some work with Imri's. It won't be a sales pitch. Absolutely, it won't be. And it will be reasonably brief, but I'll hopefully give you an oversight in terms of the possibilities that are available for you within a quarry environment. Well, limited possibilities. We can discuss other possibilities beyond what I'll be talking about here. This picture is a picture of a EWT wind turbine in or adjacent to Blackpool Pit, Imri's, within the clay area in Cornwall. Right, about us, but there won't be much about us. CleanEarth, we do wind, solar. We used to do other things, but now we focus primarily on that. Renewables within a quarry environment. Well, in the past, we've been through a lot of evolution with renewables in this country, primarily starting around 2010, 2011. It started in 2010, 2011, because that's when some structured package of incentives were introduced. So it sort of kicked off the industry. And when it kicked off the industry, it kicked off us. But the evolution of what's happened has been more or less up and down. The incentives sometimes were way over the top, so there was a hiatus. More or less, it's evolved to a situation where since 2015, there aren't really any incentives anymore. So the logic or lack of logic in investing in renewables, wind turbines, solar, for instance, has to stand or fall on its own. CleanEarth have worked pretty extensively with Imri's. Imri's, as you're all probably aware, infinitely better than I am. They have an extensive land area. The previous priority for the land area would have been the maintenance of the area, and it was the cost of the maintenance of the area that was an issue. But when we started to link up with Imri's, converted it from something that represented a cost into something that represented an asset. The land could actually earn money rather than cost money. Success factors, we'll go through those. Potential returns. What's not really commonly understood, returns may or may not be the be all and end all. Within a corporate environment, the returns don't normally overcome internal hurdle rates. And I used to work in a corporate environment, and I know they're inordinately high. The returns from these types of projects, if you were to invest in them, is 10% maybe on a wind turbine and 15% on solar. What they can provide, however, is a means of saving significant amounts of money for you, really. If you use a lot of electricity, there's a potential for reducing electricity costs, so that's fine. Investment models, there are several investment models. I'll go through those in a bit more depth in a minute. Whereas the issue more or less used to be, certainly when the industry was kicked off on the basis of those incentives, where the issue was more or less one of, is it financially viable to invest in renewables? Of course, in more recent years, and coupled with COVID and all the rest of it, there's a massively elevated realization that we've done our best to screw up the planet, whether it's from a pandemic sense or from an environmental sense. So it's not so much a question of the return now, and it's not so much a question of whether that's acceptable. This is something we've massively seen come across in recent years. It's a question of organizations and individuals recognizing and highlighting the fact that they're taking social responsibilities seriously. So it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when and how. This picture here, this picture is just on an old landfill area. It was only for rubble, as you can see from the yard, but I mean, it's just typical of what can be done. As we were going through the hiatus of the evolution of tariffs and projects being successful or not. Certainly back in something like, in relation to wind turbines, this is, back in 2014, 2015, there were a lot of wind turbines being built. And there were a lot of wind turbines being built really on the basis of the ending of these incentives. And with a lot of wind turbines being built in what seemed to be every hillside, they became unpopular. And the Conservative government, in their populist sense, took a dislike to that. So they changed the planning rules. There were a couple of things going on at the same time. One, they ceased incentives, but they also changed planning rules. And everyone thought that back in 2015, when people stopped developing wind turbines, more or less, that it was because the incentives had disappeared. But it wasn't actually. It was because the planning rules had changed, and in England, not in Scotland and not in Wales, but in England, it became almost impossible to put up a wind turbine. Solar's always been different, but it became almost impossible to put up a wind turbine because it needed to fit within a neighbourhood plan or a local plan. And if you have any experience of those, they're normally established to keep things like this out. Now, the winds of change are upon us, and that's the government is starting to introduce changes to make it easier to get wind turbines and solar through planning in England. You can, and you have always been able to do so in Scotland and Wales, which is why since then most of our activity has been focused on that. But even in 2015, it became obvious for us, with IMRIS and with others, that quarries represented a positive environment. Why? Well, normally they're a bit more isolated. They don't tend to have a dense population around the quarries. I know that by definition, a lot of the land is excavated or filled in, depending on what stage it's at. But they didn't have high population density. They normally had a fair amount of demand for electricity. And around the perimeter, there's often an area of virgin land, infinitely more difficult to put a turbine, less so solar, on reinstated land. Not impossible, because we've done it several times for IMRIS. But on virgin land, it's better for sort of obvious reasons. We have 4 turbines at the moment within the IMRIS mine area in Cornwall, 3 meg of ground-mounted solar, although we've secured permission and it's been built by others, another 6 meg. Just recently, talking about these planning changes and talking about the real opportunities that may be available now, despite this planning environment not being actively changed at the moment, within the last couple of months, we've secured planning permission for largest turbine in Cornwall, still within IMRIS land, near Longstone's tip. And it was passed without one objection, either from a member of the public or a consultee, which, given the fact that those rules still exist, is almost unheard of. And if anything ever reinforced the fact that people now massively understand that they have to do something in favour of renewables, it was that. We've got other projects on the go within that area. Success factors. Well, the thing that's always important is wind and solar resource. Wind resource down in Cornwall, or actually all across the UK, when you think about from a European perspective, it's all across the UK. But in Cornwall in particular, the wind resource is excellent. Where wind resource is good, clearly it's going to be better to put a wind turbine in. That has implications for the financial model. I'll go through that in a minute. Solar, though you wouldn't think it today, the solar resource is a lot better down in Cornwall in the south than it is in the north of Scotland. The percentage difference can be about 20% difference. So that helps, of course, with the economics. Understanding the quarry landscape, a quarry and the benefits of a quarry, they still stand out quite dramatically in terms of the opportunities that are presented. And I'm only talking about, and I know I keep going back to it, but I'm talking about wind turbines and solar. When we looked at that first picture there, back at Blackpool, actually there may be opportunities for hydro there because of the distance between the pool and the high hills behind. And that's something that's picking up interest quite dramatically. I don't know if any of you have got those resources, but that's an opportunity that's becoming more popular. Where for CleanEarth has always worked on the basis of a particular model. And this isn't a sales pitch, but it's important to know the type of model. So where we establish, for instance, or where if you, managing your quarry resources, establish that opportunities may be possible, where we've established that, we've normally approached the owner of the quarry and we've said, look, more or less, we believe that this may have scope for a wind turbine, or it may have scope for solar development. We potentially reach a commercial agreement with them in the event that we're successful. And from that point, we take all risk. So we have knowledge of the planning process. We take risk with the planning process. We invest in the planning process. If we're successful in securing the project through planning, simultaneously securing an appropriate grid connection, then on the basis of the initially agreed terms, we have a right to follow through and execute and put the installation in and start energizing. Yeah, we've got a track record. It's an excellent track record. It's not a sales pitch, but it is. What are the potential benefits? Well, the potential benefits, the renewable generation can be now really quite immense. With those initial 4 turbines that we did for Imris, each turbine, which was considered, fairly substantial at the time, but would not be considered substantial now. They were 77 meters or so, and even in a windy environment down in Cornwall, they produced 1.5 to 2 million kilowatt hours a year. So what becomes of that 1.5 to 2 million kilowatt hours a year? We can talk about that in a minute. But now that, for instance, that 135 meter turbine that has just been approved, that will produce between 10 and 11 million kilowatt hours a year. So when we're asking ourselves why this type of technology is going in place, and is there a capability to use the electricity? Well, if you're looking at 135 meter turbine, which is more or less the sort of size that you should be looking at these days, then to use it, you need to consume a lot of electricity. Potential benefits though, lower carbon emissions, it goes with the next point, the green credentials, but it's a must-have. It's an must-have. Any organization that's ignoring these probably are going to suffer a backlash fairly soon, because to the extent that the public can choose with their feet, these are going to be important factors. But there are, happily, commercial reasons to go for it. When I talk about reduced energy costs, they can be absolutely substantial. Let's go back to a wind turbine. That wind turbine that was installed back in 2014, 77 meters, that could have provided electricity at, I don't know, 6p. So any consumer could take that electricity at 6p. Now, I know that you will be significant consumers overall and maybe like discounts on the subsidy of the FIT and the ROCs, but the potential savings, curing of electricity at those sorts of rates for many organizations, and remember, it doesn't have to be the organization, the beneficiary of that electricity doesn't have to be you within the quarry. It can be any significant consumer within, I don't know, maybe even a couple of kilometers, 2-3 kilometers. That's not remotely unheard of. Wherever we put a turbine, we take all the risk, and this will be in common with other developers, but we pay a land rent, and the land rent based on Each of those turbines in that picture there that you can see, it's on the screen, they absorb only about 20 meters by 20 meters. And a typical land rent these days would probably, depends on wind speed, but would be with 25 to 35,000 per year. And that would increase with inflation over 35 years. So when we're talking about the previous situation where you had quarry assets, maybe exhausted quarry assets, and wondered what to do to reinstate, then it can be a significant benefit, the income that's associated with that in meeting those obligations. Investment models. In terms of whether it's solar or wind turbine, you can not invest anything. You can say, okay, you go ahead on the basis of your model to us or to others, and we will take the electricity with a power purchase agreement. And normally the situation will be that you have to buy all the power, and there will be a means of exporting to grid to the extent you don't need anything. If it's not logical or it's not possible, land rental deals can come about. Land rental deals either for large-scale solar or for wind turbines, and that would result in the situation I just described on the last slide. Or, and I guess it exists with turbines, although we don't do it, but it definitely exists in relation to solar, you can purchase it. And if you purchase it, the levelized cost of solar, even these days, is 4 to 5p. And for levelized cost, because I know that's one of those terms that can be so frequently misunderstood and misleading, but levelized cost just means total costs of anything associated with putting the installation in place divided by the total generation over the life of the system. So the levelized cost on that basis would categorically be 4 to 5p for solar. So putting up solar on roofs or even on the ground in this area can be logical. What are the considerations? Well, how much are you paying? Do you have suitable roofs? How do you want to go about it? That fourth point there, are you the owner-occupier? It's actually quite a gigantic question, because obviously if you own it, you make your own decisions. If you lease land, if you either lease land or lease buildings, it's a veritable nightmare getting your landlord to agree to this for all sorts of reasons: risk aversion, maybe corporate structure, and what they're fundamentally interested in is owning land and leasing it to you. But it is difficult and it can never be underestimated. This is an example of a solar farm on it. It's not a big solar farm, it's only 2 meg, but it's on a mica dam. It's on a mica dam in Cornwall. It looks like that because that's always how it's going to look, white. It's not as though green has grown and it's all been excavated. So it was more or less a dead area. It had in the middle of it some area where it flooded more frequently, so it had to be modified slightly because of that. But the only thing that was necessary to do here was secure planning permission, obviously. Planning permission in respect of this type of arrangement is really not that bad. Planners support solar. They support solar, obviously, massively more than turbines, because it's has less of a visual impact. And grid. Grid is a major issue, grid availability. All of this 2 meg had to go back to the grid. It didn't go to the landowner. It could have gone to the landowner if they had need for it, but it didn't. It went back to grid. So those are factors that determine whether it's a logical thing to do or not. This little slide summarizes what can happen in a sort of situation where a significant 2.5 meg solar site is established and a PPA put in place. Under this scenario, just going across it, the initial size of the system is 2.5 meg, but because it's quite a sunny place, Cornwall will be typical for this, it produces 2.625 meg output. It's sold back to someone for 8p, that person normally pays 13p. So they make a 5 pence saving per kilowatt hour. This is the sort of situation that's come about for the user of the electricity with zero investment. So even in this scenario, they save 98 grand a year, or 5 million over a 25-year term, assuming that both those rates increase with inflation. 500 kilowatt, 500 kilowatt, 500 kilowatt. What sort of size would 500 kilowatt? A very large shed roof within a quarry environment. Maybe 250 kilowatt is more normal for shed roofs within that type of area. It would require a big shed, but it's just sort of summarizing the same thing. Roofs, there used to be, again, back in the day, there were more concerns over structural integrity of roofs, and for that reason people were reticent to think about utilizing the assets. Now it's, I hope, pretty established that most roofs can accept solar panels. What are the issues? The issues are with what level of intensity, what's their orientation, how much electricity does the building use, and whether you want skylights normally. Skylights, the maintenance of skylights is a factor that can dramatically influence the scope for any system. A case study, probably is best to look at that in your own time. It's not a sales pitch, but for instance, to get a sense for the scale of the roof that's required, that's a 250 kilowatt roof mount. Obviously, they had a lot more scope to add more there, but decided against it. This demonstrating the ability, I know it's not a direct relation to mines, but it works in the other way. This is a recent project we installed in South Wales, in Magor. So that's an independent turbine, initially had a grid connection. In between the V of those blades is one of the largest breweries in Europe, at Magor. And that turbine supplies that brewery between the blades, and it supplies 23% of their annual electricity requirement, which is something like 40 gig a year. So, and it supplies it, I hope and believe, at a discounted rate over their grid electricity cost. So grid, the availability of grid, if you're ever thinking of doing this, depending on the nature of what you deal with, you will have grid availability. You may have substantial grid availability. If you have substantial grid availability, it can make either of these scenarios dramatically easier, because the UK grid is increasingly becoming, well, the capacity is being utilized. So if you have grid availability, it's positive, obviously. If you have a legacy grid availability, on a site that is almost exhausted, then it's even better, because normally there's even more scope there. And planning considerations, obviously, when we look at your Cornwall and Devon, when you look at Devon's dramatically more difficult in relation to wind turbines. There's a lot of interest in solar within Devon, and there's a lot of appetite within the planning authorities to accept solar. There are pockets of areas within Devon. It's much easier in Cornwall. It has been much easier in Cornwall in the past to get wind turbines. Planning considerations, apart from the visual impact and the natural sense that a planning authority is going to put on you, and the availability of grid, other substantial factors are, for instance, clearly you can't be too adjacent to AONBs. Airports are a gigantic consideration. So if you're really close to an airport, I would normally veto it straight away. Often it can be looked at because you don't want to be in the direct line of the runway, but Exeter Airport has historically vetoed anything within a close vicinity. Probably less so these days because airport radars are improving in their functionality all the time. That was hopefully quite brief and not too disinteresting. I know I focused on solar and wind, but solar and wind, they do represent the most accessible, more immediate way of transitioning to renewables. Increasingly, people are talking about batteries. They're talking about batteries, they're talking about hydrogen. Both of those probably are going to be much bigger in coming years. Batteries have to be normally combined with a more holistic solution to a problem. They're clearly going to have a part to play, and they have not quite been an economic proposition, but they're going to be part of a future that gives the grid more flexibility. So they're going to come into the picture. Solar and wind turbines, solar in particular, for different scales, and wind turbines, if you do have peculiar opportunities, represent good prospects within your environment. That's about it from me.
Okay, so thank you, Dean. That was really, really informative, especially when obviously I'm at a quarry where we do actually have a wind turbine right opposite my office. So yeah, very, very interesting. Question from Clive. Is there a future for solar complete with batteries to be able to use power when the sun is out?
Well, there's a future for solar in its own right. And what happens these days, in Cornwall, for instance, let's take an example in Cornwall. If you look in Cornwall now, on the central belt of Cornwall, where there's a lot of solar, you'll find that there's zero capacity. The DNO will not allow you to connect more solar. And if they do allow you to connect solar, it will be counterproductive in any case. Because there's so much solar on the system, yours, with its position in the queue, will just be closed down each summer on a sunny day, which is slightly counterproductive. But what you can do to combat that is you can have a battery adjacent to the solar farm, and this is something that is going to come about much more. So on the sunny day when the grid closes you, you can direct the power, continue to generate, direct the power into a battery and release it, for instance, overnight when all the other operators are gone. So there's all sorts of sophisticated models that are more or less going to redirect the timing balance of the generation that will come on stream in future years.
I'd like to say thank you, Dean, for your presentation. Thank you to everybody that's attended today. And I think that's it from us all here. But thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.